Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are having once again a little technical difficulty. Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Sorry about my hair. We fighting today. Welcome into the room with a special agenda, and we are discussing something that many parents deal with. If you have special needs kids, we've all had that moment where I have this camera turned around. Sorry, guys. All right. Soon I plan to rectify that problem and actually have a camera person. We have things working better soon. But every parent has had that moment where you feel overwhelmed as much as your child in a public setting, particularly when you're in a crowded area or on occasion when you're with family, which oftentimes causes people to withdraw from their loved ones. Soon you begin to realize that you're alone and you have imprisoned your family. Oftentimes we think that we're protecting the child. In earnest, we are protecting ourselves because we are dealing with something that we're not sure how to handle. Frequently, when children are on the spectrum and they have autism, they have meltdowns or moments in which you have lots of miscommunications because of the fact that you are struggling with how to integrate their behavioral issues and social issues with proper parenting and what that looks like. Um, as a parent of two special needs kids, I have had many moments of not knowing particularly what to do and even having their instructors from school talk to me and ask how do I handle different issues when it comes to communicating with them. And these are people that are trained and have went to school to help your child and other children learn and navigate the waters of social interactions in a way in which it does not negatively impact that child or negatively impact the other students that are in the room. And I found over time that as I started to observe my child and pay attention to how they behaved in certain situations and how different things and sensory issues um, caused them to respond. I learned that I had to have a plan. Many times it is difficult to have a plan because there are different things that go awry. You can't control all the situations that you will deal with daily, and neither can they. But you can give yourself, your family, friends, and your mate and yourself those skills to make a footprint so that other people can follow in it. Um, The reason I say footprint and not step is because generally, if there is a footstep in the dirt, in the sand, in the snow, those are easily erased. You can rub over them, water will rinse them away, the sun will melt it. But if you have a footprint, if ever you have, they have these little kits that you can get at Home Depot. You can even get them at Walmart. Where some people make little templates that have, you can, it's made of, it's a cement mix, or they have it where you can do it in resin, or you can do it in clay. There's a lot of different materials that you can use, but they are hardened. And usually people do it for their newborns, or they do it as their children grow. And they'll make stepping stones in their yard with their handprint or with their feet. Those are more durable. Those you can trace. Those you can keep. Those you can pass along. When you have a footprint, it's something that, and you have set that in stone, that is something that other people can duplicate. Oftentimes, because of the fact that we are afraid that other people will have a worse time than us because we feel like we know our children and they don't know our children, we are afraid that the child will be traumatized, when in fact we're actually protecting ourselves more than we are setting them up for success. We want them to be able to make sure that their visit with their grandparent, or with their aunt or uncle, or with um, other friends, or even a daycare provider will go well. Because not having a plan is not a plan. It puts you in a position where you can't go out with your mate. You can't go to certain things. You become reclusive. You become a recluse because at some point because you no longer have those securities that other people take for granted often, you are, it starts to feel very alone. And sometimes you may feel judged. But it's important that because we know our children, we start setting a pattern of what it is that works for them. What do you do when certain things happen? What do you do when you're having a hard time with getting into bed? What's your plan for if they're hitting someone? How do you deal with their meltdowns? How do you help other family members understand how to deal with their meltdowns? What do you do in the event that what they've done isn't working? What's the backup plan for them without having to interrupt their work day, or have to pull them from different programs, or not have anyone that can babysit them? It's important that we set a firm but flexible template of behavioral redirection. Well, what does that look like? For each person and each child, it's different. The reason it's different is because of the fact that each of our children are different. They're not the same. And when you know that you're dealing with someone and they're each one of them has their own personality. And because we know that they have their own personality, we have to figure out how we can help them best. Well, the best way to help them for each child is to figure out what works for them disciplinary wise, what their sensory issues are, how to communicate with them so that they understand you, help them to no longer be overwhelmed. But first, you have to figure out how to calm down yourself, how not to get to the point where you're more focused on what you think other people think. And also, we have the second question is, what is our plan for other, I'm sorry, have I put a plan in place for others that's consistent, that will help them with the behavioral adjustments that they'll need? First, we have to assess what works for our child. Does your child respond verbally? Do they respond and do they understand non-verbally more? In different situations is different. For children who receive therapy, many of them, if they're not verbal, many of them may use a speak box, or they with them they use ASL, which is sign language. And for those who use ASL, it's difficult to ask. It's a big ask, I'll say, to tell someone, I need you to learn sign language to communicate with my child. Now there is another kind of sign language which is more of a crude form of sign language of explaining. Like for my kids, when we have our Bible meetings, I learned that talking to them only made them talk back to me during the meeting. And I don't mean talk back to me in the sense that they are being disrespectful. What was happening was I'm trying to get them to be quiet and they're explaining why they were talking. And you're just like, I don't want to drag this child out of here. This is not going to help and this won't solve the issue. So I started to explain to them in ways in which they understood. I started to use rudimentary ways of sign language, which instead of telling them, I need you to be quiet or stop talking, I would just go. And when they would get ready to say something else, which means stop. Now, they do know some other actual sign language, but I started to give them the basics so that the less I said to them in that setting, it made it easier for them to cooperate. We had less issues where we had to go outside, as they say. We had to, and I realized that the other thing that happens with a lot of parents is we bear the burden of how we were corrected when we were younger. And people saying, oh, the old way works. It works for some people. Every engine does not fit in every car because each car is a different make. So it's created differently. Some engines are in the back of the car. A truck engine won't fit in a car. So when it comes to the correction of your child, it's important that you learn who they are and allow the family members to learn who they are in small segments. No one learns how to cook everything in one day. They are small lessons that start out with the rudimentary things, how to chop, how to boil water, lessons and explanations in why you have to put this here, why this has to remain cold, how to start a meal and start with the meal where the longest things you start first and the shorter thing, the things that cook the least amount of time, when the other things are almost done, those are the things you start so that everything is ready at the same time. I give that example so that we understand there are steps and processes, and so that each person will understand that you give them those little opportunities, but you give them those tools and little lessons because you don't want with your mother or their other grandparents or whatever to talk down to them, but you do want to let them understand that yes, I understand how you corrected them. This may or may not work for them, because for some children, beating them in the middle of a meltdown is going to cause so many more problems than you thought. This is going off the cliff. It's not going off a hill, it's going off a cliff. And you begin to learn what you need to do in those particular situations so that you can help them, and not because we often bear the burden of how we were taught as far as what correction needed to be for a child. And because we've learned that though everything doesn't fit each child, different things, we're affected culturally. Different communities do it differently. And it's done differently for boys than it is for girls. And when I say gender, I mean what we assign ourselves or what we feel society has assigned us based on what men are supposed to do and what women are supposed to do or what their treatment is supposed to be. Oftentimes we are harder on boys than we are on girls in certain areas, particularly with correction. We have been led to believe and try to make boys feel like it is not okay to cry in public or to cry. It's not okay to be overwhelmed or frustrated. But in reality, that is not realistic. It doesn't help them to thrive as they get older, and it certainly doesn't work with children who are on the spectrum. Um, it affects you as much as it does them because you're overwhelmed. And if you are overwhelmed, it's very hard. You get a rein on a horse that you scared of. You can't calm someone down if you're not calm. So it's really important that as parents, once we start to see those little things that trigger them, it's okay to kind of keep a little journal, even if it's just jot down one thing. It doesn't have to be a whole passage because oftentimes as parents, we don't have that time. It may be important for you to just, if you're a person that you're more visual and you know you're not going to have time to write right then, if you have your phone on you, take a small picture or a video, not to share with others, but for you to observe yourself, for you to take a mental note, later on say a little prayer so you can figure out, okay, they were upset because we were running late. They didn't get their cookies that they always get at this certain time, or they didn't get whatever it was that they wanted. And you have to explain to them when it's going to happen. I've found that with my children and with a lot of children that are on the spectrum, that they don't do well with abstract concepts. What do I mean when I say abstract concepts? They don't do well with things that are not definitive. They need a definitive answer. They need to know that when you say they're going to get cookies later, they want to know what time later. I realized that at one point my daughter was having a meltdown over something. And I kept telling her, because I was in the middle of trying to do something else that I had to do, and it was time sensitive. I was handling some business, trying to. And she kept wanting to talk to me. And I didn't want her to feel like a bird, but I could not address her need then. And in my mind, I thought, it finally dawned on me that I needed to tell her when it was going to happen. It's just like you could not tell your boss. Most people cannot, unless you work for yourself. And then that doesn't bode well with your customers if your answer for when you're coming is always soon, but there's no timeline, and that timeline that varies greatly. At some point, it is unreasonable to them. It's unreasonable. Who would want that? If you went to a restaurant and your food didn't come, and you said, okay, we've been sitting here 45 minutes waiting for fries and some chicken fingers. And their answer to you was soon, and you waited one more hour, and then your stomach starting to growl. You're getting sick at the table. You're waiting for your food, and every time the manager comes, the only response you got was soon. You'd be livid at some point. But the position you were in was there were no other open restaurants and no grocery stores that were open. And you weren't anywhere where you were going to be able to get food for a very long time. So your options were absolutely, seemingly nothing, just that. And it seems to be for them, that's what it looks like on their side of the mirror. That's what it looks like to them. If you give them a response where they don't know and it's in the air of when something's going to happen, they really need a definitive answer. So it started to occur to me that for anything I needed to do for her, or if there was a delay, she's fine if there's a delay. If you tell her when it's going to happen, if you say, we can't go shop, there have been times when she was having a really bad day. And I said, okay, what we're going to do, rather than telling her we're not going to go because you're having a bad day, and because I tried that and that went horrible. And it dawned on me to tell her, since we're not having a smooth day, how about we have a treat? And instead of worrying about this, what about if we just do this tomorrow? And then we can do something else you like to do also. Because I recognized that she was overwhelmed and she was going to get there and still be overwhelmed. And then I would be overwhelmed. And it would be just too much for both of us. And it was getting later and later in hopes that this would improve. I knew that it would be better another day. But letting her know that we're going to do it a different time and letting her know what time worked. And it worked because it was no longer an abstract concept. So having something for them that is concrete works more if they need things that they can feel and touch, because that's more of what they understand. Your opinion is your opinion on it to them. Even if they're facts, if it's not something that they can see, it doesn't feel concrete. You're saying it's something's going to happen. They're not clear on that because it's not happening. So I started to form a plan where I instantly started to let her know, and it works with my son too, but it's a little different for him because he's somewhere else on the spectrum. Emotionally, there are certain things that you can have a conversation with him and he sort of processes differently. So for each of them, that works more. So I started to pass that on to my family. I don't tell them what they can't do, I tell them what we can do. So because they figured out that that works, so many things that were happening that were negative became positive. Because even with my son, when I have to correct him disciplinary wise, we had an incident where I won't go into all the details. It would take too long. Explaining to him about something that he had done. And I explained to him, well, because he made that choice, he no longer had the privilege of having his controlling system. And we just have to try again another day. I said, so and he ordinarily gets it on the weekends. Once he does his schoolwork for the week, because he doesn't get it during the week, he gets it on Friday evening. He returns it Sunday evening. long as he does the things he's supposed to do and he doesn't get himself in trouble watching or doing something he should not be doing, he gets to keep it. And that's how I put it to him. I don't say I'm going to take this. I don't start threatening him because they don't do well with threats. If you want an autistic person to go off the rails on you, start threatening them. People who aren't autistic don't do well with being threatened. They do not. Most people do not appreciate it. But if you inform them of what privileges they do have and what they can do, that works so much better. I started to inform him, okay, since it didn't go so great this time, and these are some decisions that you chose that weren't the best decisions, how about we just try next weekend and I'll just keep it this time? He was like, okay, that's solid. I earned that. He instantly understood that. But before, when I would go into this long speech and trying to communicate with him in that way, I got crying and screaming and upset and anger. And then when you have this child starting to have this outburst, there have been occasions as parents that we, because we're human, may forget that they have the issues that they have. And then you have to maybe walk away, because if you don't walk away and rein it in, you might accidentally discipline somebody the way you was disciplined. Mm-hmm. You may end up in a social visit from social services. So you decide to walk off. But I learned that that was effective for him. And I found that even dealing with other adults and children that were special needs, rather than confronting them and threatening them and saying all this stuff, I said, okay, so this did not work. How about we do this instead? When they started having meltdowns, I started to get low and put my forehead to their forehead when they were little, because I've learned that when they're really small and you're much bigger than they are, getting close and down near them makes it where they don't feel intimidated and less overwhelmed. It's okay also to remove them from situations that is too much. Sometimes they have aversions to smells, textures of foods. So, in certain situations, like with my children, fortunately, don't have any current food aversions. Rayla had one for a little while, where she went through a spell where she wouldn't eat tomatoes, but she had eaten them for 9 years. So I figured, they wasn't having a good season that year anyway, and I said, well, if you don't want them, we won't make it. And that was the end of that. um and eventually she decided to try them again. Same thing with my son. For a long time, the only thing he would not eat was mushrooms. Now he loves them, but I did not force them. It was something that they had to come to on their own to decide that they were going to be okay with it. Because as an adult, we give ourselves privilege that things that we don't want, don't have a taste for, we don't think it tastes good, we give ourselves permission to not partake in it. So I feel like it was fair to make them feel like they have some authority in their own life in some way. Oftentimes, it's important to give them choices where they're choosing, but you're still helping them choose. To less complicate things as far as getting my children together for school and other things. And we were having some issues for a while with who was wearing what, because one of them in particular had this thing where they would want to wear sandals no matter what the weather was. So what I did was I started to put out several options. So they still got to pick themselves. It wasn't like I was putting their choices and their opinions behind them. They still had the power and the privilege to pick for themselves. Because oftentimes, as they get older, it does get to be a power struggle. And then it gets to be where you're in a public setting with people wondering why you're arguing with a child when they're just trying to state their choices and defend their decisions, which is what you do want them to do when they get to be an adult. And as they're getting to be an adult with you, you have to show them how to do it in a way that is not creating conflict between the two of you. Not because of the opinions of strangers, but because you want peace and you want them to have the structure to have a life that is not constant conflict, where they cannot hold a job, they cannot keep friends. Because oftentimes, when they are on the spectrum, there are things that they do not know that they should not say. So, with my son, because he has Asperger's, he says stuff without thought that it might be offensive. He just says what he thought at that moment. I remember once he told me, and I think I might have said that on here once before, that he told me I looked cute in my dress, even though I looked fat. And I said, thank you, but you could have kept the fat. The mirror told me already. I appreciate it, but I wasn't confused when I looked in the mirror. I did not think that somehow I had lost weight between walking away from the mirror and standing here in front of you. And he says, I'm sorry. I did not mean to hurt your feelings. And oftentimes we have to make that clear because feelings is sometimes a bit of an abstract concept too for them, because it's a social situation, and it's something that they will struggle with. So I have to make it clear and ask the questions that need to be asked. Why do you think that was inappropriate? What do you think could have been done better? Rather than lashing out, every moment is a teachable moment, but you have to set that footprint so that they also can guide themselves as they get older. When they're younger, it's a little more difficult. It is difficult differently when they're a teenager because they're discovering who they are and not trying to blur those lines because they don't see the lines we see. I always liken it to people being colorblind. Everybody doesn't see color, meaning it can be right in front of them, but because they have that visual impairment, they won't see what you see because it's not clear for them. Their eyes don't work like that. So the same thing, and I liken that with that for that example, because with people who are on the spectrum or have other delays, as we call them, or learning difficulties, they don't observe the things that we observe. They can see it, but it doesn't mean to them what it means to you and me. Um, I had to teach him not, even though he was an affectionate child, I remember him being very young and him wanting to hug girls. Like he saw, we were in a restaurant once and we were leaving and he saw this girl and she looked upset and he ran up to her and hugged her. And she was like, oh, and I told my husband, I said, we've got to stop him because if he doesn't stop this behavior, he going to get tased one day. You can't run up to women to hug them. Yes, it's sweet, but as you get older, it's not always recognizable what's happening. Everybody doesn't understand what's happening or what you see. They just don't see it. They don't know it. So it's important that you give them those guidelines. And when you see those patterns forming, for him, occasionally I just have to give that head nod. We'll make eye contact. I go. And my daughter is starting to pick up on it too. But it's important that we let go of that guilt that we have when our children don't behave in the ways that other people behave. You have to remember that the engine that other people have for their car won't fit in yours. Your child is not the same. You did nothing wrong. They're still wonderful, a gift and a blessing. But you have to help them maintain their life differently. You have to give yourself your personal health care, self-care differently. Because we all need something else. What one person needs to relax doesn't work for another person. So we have to keep all that in mind when we are helping each other and being kind and being supportive. And it's okay to let your loved ones know that you do want their help. But you have to let them know how you need their help. I always say, it's not help if you're doing it your way and not the way that the person that needs the help asked you. That's not help. If I ask you to clean my closet out and you throw all my clothes away, that wasn't help. That was your idea of making it easy for you. So we have to be honest with our loved ones and with ourselves to not overwhelm them either, because we want to not isolate ourselves and our children. And we don't want to traumatize them. But we don't want to put people in a position where they don't know what's going on and we are not being reasonable or they're not being reasonable and we haven't given them any tools. Because if you don't give anybody any tools to fix something that requires tools, or you don't give them the right tools to fix it the way it needs to be fixed, be prepared for it to stay broke. You all have a wonderful evening. Be kind to everybody. Be loving to your loved ones, because kindness is a choice. You all have a wonderful evening. And thank you for joining the room with a special agenda.